Okay, good evening, everyone. Good evening and welcome to the Arthur Conan Doyle Centre's Tuesday Talks. My name is Anne Treherne and I'm founder of the Arthur Conan Doyle Centre, so it's my great pleasure to welcome you here this evening and to welcome Chris Rowe. Now, Chris has a very impressive CV and I have to say a very long one as well. So bear with me.
Keep it short, keep it short.
Keep it short. Okay, Chris is Professor of Psychology at the University of Northampton and Director of the Centre for Psychology and Social Sciences there. He's also President of the Society for Psychical Research. I'm doing, as I said, keeping it short. He has previously held the chair of the British Psychological Society's Transpersonal Psychology section and President of the Parapsychological Association. He's Associate Editor for the Journal of Parapsychology, and he's on the editorial board for the Journal of the Society for Psychical Research and Transpersonal Psychological Review. Phew! He's also a very good friend, I'm pleased to say, and he paid me the huge accolade of writing the foreword to my book, Arthur and Me, for which I will be eternally grateful. Thank you, Chris. And he's also a good friend to the Arthur Conan Doyle Centre too. He has been a regular visitor there, and indeed he's twice brought members of his team from Northampton up to Edinburgh to run a whole day workshop. We had run a Psi Saturday. We've twice run that now, and it was a whole day workshop of interactive experiments and research, hearing all about their findings in various aspects of Psi and the paranormal. And I was just thinking, Chris, actually, it's probably about a year ago just now since you were here. It's almost, I think it was February last year, and it was probably, I think, the last workshop we ran at the Arthur Conan Doyle Centre. Wow. Before we all got locked down. Did you remember when we used to have people, we used to have live, real workshops? Well, Chris ran one of the last ones before we locked down. So I'm delighted to welcome you back again, Chris, albeit virtually. And tonight, Chris's talk is entitled, What We Can Learn from Cases of Spontaneous Paranormal Experiences. So welcome back, Chris. Delighted to have you here and looking forward to your talk. Over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Anne. As I struggle with technology to share some slides with you, I'd like to thank Anne for the very warm introduction. After a long introduction like that, it's very tempting to say thank you and good night, because it's all going to be downhill from here. But hopefully you'll find some of the things that I have to share with you interesting and informative. That will be the plan. So I can't share yet. Yes, I can. There we are. So hopefully in a few seconds, you should be able to see my title slide. If you can't see something, please do let us know in the chat. I'm sure Scott could let me know, give me a shout out, particularly if the pages don't change. During lockdown, many of our classes also take place on various platforms. And I did have the unfortunate experience of speaking to some of our PhD students in a workshop where the slides didn't change from slide 1. And I was about 20 minutes into the session chatting away quite merrily before any of them plucked up the courage to actually say, hold on a minute, we've no idea what you're talking about, because you're referring to things on screen that we can't see. So hopefully things will marry together better tonight. And thanks especially for inviting me back. And so I gave one of these Tuesday talks before Christmas. And in that talk, I thought you might be interested to find out a little bit about current approaches and methods that are being used in modern day parapsychology to explore various anomalous experiences. How do we bring them into the laboratory? How do we test those phenomena in ways which are rigorous but fair? And hopefully there are some lines of research there that maybe were a surprise to you, might have suggested something that you might want to follow up in your own time. What I've tried to do in that talk and again tonight is to try and illustrate the themes by drawing on the particular research that we've been doing at the University of Northampton. We're very fortunate in having a close-knit community at the university in the psychology department that is focused particularly on exceptional experiences and consciousness studies. So the logo you see here, the EECS, not only serves as an abbreviation of exceptional experiences and consciousness studies, but it also might be what you shout out during a ghost vigil when you're on investigation. And that community is very wide ranging. It ranges from people who have a background in psychotherapy, who are very interested in lived experience and the kind of meaning that people make around their experiences. At one side, particularly focusing on things like spiritual and religious experiences, as well as what we might call parapsychological in a more narrow sense. And it ranges all the way through to fairly hard-nosed quantitative experimental studies at the other end, particularly in terms of the consciousness studies end, and particularly monitoring brain activity and seeing how that might relate to the experiences that people are reporting. So that's kind of the material that I touched on last time and some of the examples I gave. And what I'd like to do today is to focus on the complementary story that runs alongside that, which also is a focus of ongoing research by myself and by colleagues, particularly at Northampton. And so I just want to give you a flavour of that alternative, because hopefully what it will serve to do is to avoid a tendency to alienate people who are having the experiences. Because with highfalutin experimental procedures, they can seem quite alien. And they can seem to have very little to do with the experiences that you start with. So hopefully some of the research that I'll talk about today has a more direct resonance, perhaps, for your own experiences. The way I normally would run a session is, if anything's unclear, particularly when I get excited, I have a tendency to speak too quickly. So if something isn't very clear, do put something in the chat, and I'm really happy to go back to something. Or if you've got a burning question, I'm quite happy to entertain those now. The other side of that deal, however, is I am very likely to overrun my allotted 55, 60 minutes. So please bear with me if you have to be somewhere else towards the end. I completely understand, but hopefully I can keep you hanging on for a little bit at least. So that's kind of where we are. When we ask people, members of the public, how they imagine research in parapsychology, the kind of typical examples are rather outdated. I used a slide similar to this last time. People might still imagine that researchers spend their time doing card guessing studies of the sort that J.B. Rhine made popular in the 1920s through to about the 1940s, maybe the early 50s. These were a very important development stage for parapsychology, but people just don't use those kinds of tests anymore. Also, one might imagine that there's lots of field investigations that go on, that people are investigating haunted locations or visiting sites of poltergeist activity. These are really exciting and interesting, but they are not the kind of day-to-day staple business of parapsychologists who are based within university departments. And fantastic and lovely as he is, Uri Geller, we don't tend to meet individuals who have such pronounced claims that allow us to test an individual under secure circumstances in such a way that we end up being able to validate the claims that they make. Because we're based in the psychology department, we're especially interested in looking at patterns of performance across individuals. So to understand how experiences and abilities might vary across a population, say with personality or to do with circumstances or the relationship you have with the other people who might feature in your experience, and to see what that might tell us about the mechanism of the phenomena. So we don't tend to do that kind of research. I'll just recap on some of the kinds of research which are currently ongoing in the laboratory, and then that'll act as a kind of a background or a foil to the main focus for today, which is on spontaneous experiences. So we have students come to the university to visit for open days, or we normally do when we're not in lockdown, and we bring them into the psychology lab very grandly, and they're slightly disappointed to discover that on the whole these days a psychology lab consists of desks with computers, PCs on them, that much is software based. The advances that we've seen recently in technology are fantastic. They give us great control over situations and allow us to manipulate variables with great exquisite sensitivity in a way that we couldn't have done even 20 years ago when I was 25 years ago when I was doing my PhD. So things have moved on dramatically, and they allow us to ask questions that we couldn't have asked 20, 25 years ago. And some of those are particularly around expressions of telepathy or precognition, for example, under conditions where people may not be consciously aware that they're being psychic, that they're taking advantage of information that is only available by ESP or precognition or clairvoyance or some other such. So a typical example, just to illustrate, is a suite of experiments that Daryl Bem has made popular. So Daryl Bem is a social scientist based in the United States. He is retired now. He has had a very kind of a well-established career, very highly regarded in social psychology. He was a co-writer of the classic textbook for undergraduates in the States, called ordinarily Hilgard and Atkinson, who were the first authors of that book. And he was honored to be one of the co-authors of that book for 2 of its issues over the years. He has a theory named after him, which still features in those textbooks. So he's a major figure, but his reputation has taken a dip in recent times when he has declared that he thinks there might be something to these notions of ESP and precognition and so on. And he thinks he has some experiments that might be able to demonstrate them. So one example of that is that he would have his participants sit in front of a computer and he gets them to react to stimuli that are presented on the computer. So hopefully you can see the screen. You've got a computer on the computer, and there's a fixation point in the middle. So you focus on that, and at a random moment, a picture will appear, and you have to press as quickly as possible without making mistakes one or other of these 2 buttons. You press the left-hand button if it's a positive picture, and you press the right-hand button if it's a negative picture. And on this particular trial, for most of us, that would be regarded as a positive picture, and so we click the left-hand button as quickly as possible. Now, there is a paradigm in mainstream psychology that explores this that's called a priming task. And in a priming task, what you do is you present the participant with a picture like this. So this is called a mask. And the idea is that when you've been presented with a stimulus, it leaves an after image on the retina. And so what the mask does is it obliterates that after image. So you start with, if you like, a clean slate. Then you have a fixation point. And then just before you present the picture that you want the person to react to, you flash up really quickly, and often too quickly for the person to register what the word might say, a word. And then the picture appears and they respond as quickly as possible. And in the classic mainstream psychology priming task, what they find is that even though people cannot tell you what the word was, or whether it was a nice word or a horrible word, it still affects how quickly they press the correct button. If they are discrepant, as they are here, we've got nauseating and then a nice picture, it slows people down. They press the smiley button less quickly than they do when the prime says something like beautiful or heavenly. And this is a fairly robust effect. Thousands of experiments have demonstrated that priming is effective. The effects are really rapid. We're talking about maybe 50 milliseconds, something like that. So what would that be? A 20th of a second might be the difference in times that you're getting from different trials, whether they're positive or negative. And people are not really aware of much, apart from looking at the pictures and responding as quickly as possible when they see the image. And Daryl, very sneakily, all he did was he changed the order of the elements, the sequence. So in his experiments, he started with the mask as before. So we start with a blank slate. Then we have our fixation point. Then we have the picture that you react to as quickly as possible. And so you press positive or negative as quickly as you can. And after you've made your decision, when it's way too late to affect your decision making, they then flash unconsciously, too quickly to see, a word that's either positive or negative. And bizarrely, Daryl was able to show, even in this version of the experiment, that people were affected by the valence of the word. They were slower if they were discrepant. So if it's a negative word and a positive picture, they were slower in clicking the positive button. Now, in mainstream psychology, there's no way to understand that phenomenon, to make sense of it, because the information you're taking advantage of doesn't exist at the time when you're pressing the button. It only exists, if you like, in the mind of the computer. So it could still be technically clairvoyance. It may be precognition of your own future, and that's typically how Darrell imagines it. In some of the experiments, it's possible for the computer not to decide whether to show you a positive or negative picture until after you've made your choice. So it could possibly be precognition. So we've got this really cool effect that seems to show that in a really robust design of an experiment, which is standard practice in psychology departments across the country, here and in the States, we're able to demonstrate precognition. Really cool. Next one. Another way in which parapsychologists are researching a phenomena is by looking at how we respond physiologically when there may not be any conscious response to the phenomenon. And the way, as if we're carrying information that maybe affects the way we behave. So, for example, in pressing buttons or choices that we might make, even though there's no conscious component to that, there's no cognitive element. So we're not aware of being psychic, we just maybe happen to make lucky or opportune decisions that things tend to work out for us, that kind of thing. And this can be monitored quite well these days by a standard electrodermal activity setup like this. So we have Mark. He was a research assistant with us for a number of years. He ran these experiments, so that's why he gets to be the stooge sitting in the chair to demonstrate the setup. So you'll see he's got one hand, his left hand is just laid on the arm of the chair as he's looking at the screen. And on his hand are some sensors that are touching close to his finger and further away on the palm of his hand. And these sensors are passing a very mild electric current across the surface of his skin, and they're monitoring essentially how resistant the surface of the skin is to that current. And basically, this is a very accurate and useful measure of general arousal level. So it fluctuates very naturally. If you stand behind somebody and clap your hands, you will see immediately a spike in their EDA, even if they're not particularly responding strongly to the stimulus. If you whisper names that are meaningful to them, you'll see a response in the EDA, even when they say, no, I've never heard that name before in my life. I think you have. Your EDA, your physiology is telling me something different. And that's why Jeremy Kyle was a big fan of this when he used to be asking people if they'd ever kissed somebody other than their wife in the recent past. He could catch people out by giving them his EDA truth tests. It's not that reliable for that kind of purpose because people get very nervous, understandably, in that situation, and it's very easy to give false readings. But in experimental lab situations where you're not asking about people's love affairs, we're on safer ground, I think. And in this kind of situation, what you do is you present the participant Mark with stimuli on the screen. And those stimuli will either be arousing stimuli. So you might use, for example, pictures of people with illnesses or car crash victims. You might have horrific images, a snarling, growling dog. You might have somebody about to step on broken glass. Those kinds of images will flash on screen. And although they're not strong enough for people to feel any trauma as a result of them, you absolutely can see a response in their electrodermal activity. And then on other occasions, you present people with a neutral picture. So it might be a tree-lined avenue, it might be a chair, something really quite dull, a vase, something like that, which is kind of quite nice to look at, but doesn't particularly arouse emotions positively or negatively. And people respond differently trial by trial, but if you collect enough trials and average across those, you get a very characteristic, predictable plot that looks something like this. And you'll see in here, in the middle bit, there's a segment that's called during. So that's the period during which the person is being presented with the stimulus. That's either an arousing stimulus, so stepping on the glass or something similar, or it's a calming stimulus, the tree-lined avenue. And we see that when you do lots and lots of trials, the person's arousal level is significantly different across those two. And if you measure that, there's a very standard, predictable difference that you see between the two. Bizarrely, when people have looked at this earlier period, they find that there's an anomalous difference there as well. And that also is highly significant. This is very peculiar because this left-hand anomalous difference occurs not only before the participant sees an image on the screen, but actually before the computer has decided what kind of image to show on the next trial. So the computer even doesn't yet know whether it's going to be positive or negative, and yet it looks like people are already preparing themselves for what kind of image it's going to be. Oh, this is a horrible image that's coming up. I'm going to steel myself for that. I'm going to get ready for that. Or it's okay, I'm off the hook. I don't think this one's going to be so bad after all. And they start to relax into it and the EDA goes down. So again, a very profound effect that we certainly couldn't have discovered 25 years ago. We didn't have the technical equipment that was sensitive enough to capture that. And it really suggests something maybe about the mechanism, the way in which psi phenomena might be embodied first of all, and only later maybe come to conscious awareness. And we'll see some examples that might fit with that later on that I've tended to call foreboding incidents. So incidents where people feel uneasy, there's something that's not quite right, and maybe it takes a little while for it to settle on a particular person or a particular situation as the cause of that sense of discombobulation. And then the next example, the final one to show you, is we're really excited about developments in EEG apparatus that allow us to monitor people's brain activity. And at Northampton, we're very interested in replicating some research that's been done in the States by these two, Arnaud Delorme and Julie Beischel, working together. So Arnaud is part of the Institute of Noetic Studies, which is where Dean Radin is based. Julie has her own research facility at the Windbridge Institute, and she's doing some really interesting work on mediums. Arnaud brings the kind of EEG technical expertise to their project. And what's really cool about what they've been doing is they've been able to demonstrate that when they work with mediums who wear one of these skull caps, and if you look carefully on the skull cap, you'll see there's an array of sensors at various points around the skull. And these are monitoring the activity of the brain, the cortex, just underneath the skull, underneath the bone. So it's kind of surface level. It's not really getting into deep structures of the brain, like something like an fMRI might do, but it does relate to the phenomenology, the kind of subjective experience somebody's likely to be having at that time, and also which parts of the brain are doing all the work. So for example, there's an area about a third of the way up towards the top of the skull, which is the prefrontal cortex, and that's responsible for a lot of the kind of higher order intellectual work that we do. That's got some of the association areas that we use for things like meaning and inference, making sense of situations, the kind of cognition that tends to happen there. And coolly, what they've found is that there seem to be differences in brain activity, without getting to the detail, on trials when mediums seem to have a good connection and they're providing accurate information to the recipient, in contrast with other trials when things are not going so well and the ratings are not so high. And if we're able to demonstrate that more consistently going forwards, then there could be something really interesting to work with there. There seem to be two types of activity which predominate. One of these is kind of theta level activity, which reflects a deep state of relaxation, may accord with things like a deep meditative state, not the deep states of sleep, lighter than that with some awareness, but still very introspective states, but also gamma, which is a heightened activity level, which very often reminds me of the way in which some mediums talk about raising their vibration and with the spirit world lowering its vibration to have some area of common overlap. It may be that technically that's literally realized in the way that mediums shift their brain activity to raise their vibration, to have these cells firing at the top end of their capacity, their firing range. One really nice feature of this experiment was that they measured EEG activity while they asked the mediums to do different tasks. So as well as bringing spirit forward and having a connection with an individual in spirit who may want to communicate to their living relatives, they would also have a situation in which the person imagined a person, just from fantasy. So invent a person, imagine what that person might look like, what their physical features might be like, how they might have died, and so on. And in another situation, they had them listen to an account of a fictitious person. And in a fourth condition, they had them recall somebody that they actually knew, a real person, but use their own memories to evoke a sense of that person. What does that person look like? What kind of hobbies and interests do they have? What are the significant life events that they've been through? And what they've discovered is that the brain activity that we see when bringing spirit forward is characteristically different from all of the other three. And this will be really useful in the longer term in fielding against a fairly standard criticism of mediums, which is, well, it's self-deception, if anything. It's just your imagination, but you're maybe not very good at monitoring that you are the cause of this, and you're reading too much into it. It's really just fantasy. It's based on your own memories, or just your imagination going wild, and suggestion. You know, when people tell you that you're entering a deeper trance, you think that you are, but nothing is actually really changing. Well, this very strongly argues against that. And in some of the demonstration practicals that we do at the Arthur Findlay College, we've been able to show our mediums that, yes, indeed, when they go into a light trance to make a contact, say, with their control, something physiologically actually happens. That they're not just imagining that something is changing. We can monitor and we can document that in the EEG traces. So it's really exciting. However, having said all that, I'm going to actually critique those lines of research. And I think sometimes it's very easy to be beguiled by sophistication, to run with rather clever designs of experiments and fancy technology. It always reminds me of the Monty Python sketch where you have the machine that goes ping, and as soon as they bring that in, then everything's going to be okay in treating the patient. But really what we're doing in bringing that stuff in, shifting our focus towards those, is we're shifting our focus farther away from the core experiences that people report. And the findings from those experiments are one further step removed from those original experiences. And that could pose what I would call the cocktail party problem. So the cocktail party problem is if you go to a party and meet new people and they ask you what you do for a living and you say you do research in parapsychology, there is a real danger that you then have nothing else you can say to those people about their experiences if all the work that you do exists in some ivory tower somewhere that involves expensive equipment, very tiny effects and p-values and all sorts of stuff. If you can't speak to real people about real experiences, then you're mostly wasting your time. That's at the heart of this. So what's really important to me is this research cycle that we have on screen. That it's really important to start at the top of this cycle with real world phenomena. What is it we want to understand? How do people describe their experiences? What seem to be the core features of that experience? And then we have to ensure that we incorporate those elements into anything we do in the laboratory. Of course, we want to introduce some degree of control. We want to have some sense of being able to rule out normal explanations because we have a tighter situation that we are in charge of. So, for example, with mediums, you can control very easily for things like deception or cold reading. You can control for things like non-verbal communication from the client. So you can do all of those things. But you can only do all of those things once you have a thorough understanding from the medium's perspective about what is the sine qua non. So what is the essential features of the situation that must prevail when you get into that lab situation. If you follow the first half of this cycle well, then it guarantees, in my mind, that you can do the second half, because it will mean that whatever you discover in your research will resonate with those people, the real people in the real world. So that this is a really important scheme that underpins quite a lot of the stuff that we try and do at Northampton. And so the rest of today, what I want to do is maybe talk about some examples of how we're trying to live that and make sure we stick to it. So that was the preamble, and it's taken me half an hour to get this far. So please do bear with me if we run out of time. Okay, so we've done that one. Here we go. So the three examples I want to talk about are subjects of ongoing research at the University of Northampton. And what we're really interested in for today is collecting cases. So real world instances where people had an experience which for them is paranormal, is spiritual, it's parapsychological, is mystical. However people want to label it, we want to draw together as many of those cases as we can so we can start to have a richer, more thorough understanding of how this occurs in situ in the real world. I often have a slide at this point of Elmer Fudd trying to catch Bugs Bunny because J.B. Rhine famously once said, if you want to make rabbit stew, you first need to catch a rabbit. And what I think he means by that is if you want to run an experiment in a laboratory where ESP happens, you first need to know enough about ESP and how it operates in the real world, what its natural ecosystem is, what its habits are. Otherwise, you're never going to catch the darn thing and you're never going to get it into your laboratory in the first place. And so the kind of work that I'm talking about here is essentially, this is David Attenborough going out and discovering primates in the wild and understanding how they live their normal natural lives in order to ensure that if we have to have primates in laboratories, for example, or in zoos, we can ensure that their situations there are as naturalistic as possible and they're able to thrive. So that was a better link than I expected, because the first person I want to talk about is a marine biologist, Sir Alister Hardy. He spent his career at the University of Oxford. He was at Manchester College and was a highly respected marine biologist, very well known. He was knighted for his services to science. He was a fellow of the Royal Society, so extremely well regarded in his field. As he approached retirement, he decided that rather than retire and kind of move to the south of France, he wanted to continue his research, but look at something that had always interested him, which was people's religious experiences. And so he established the Religious Experience Research Unit, the RERC. So at the beginning, I think this was with him in Oxford, but it's now at the University of Wales, Trinity St David, I think, that university within the University of Wales collection. And one of his core aims was to collect and share people's accounts of their religious or spiritual experiences. And so he would appear often in the media, inviting people through popular magazines, newspaper articles, etc., inviting people to write to him with accounts of their experiences. And he tried to broaden this as much as possible. He wanted to secularize it in a way, or at least he didn't want to effectively rule out particular types of experience. And so he coined this phrase: have you ever been aware of or influenced by a presence or power, whether you call it God or not, which is different from your everyday self? So this captures this sense of something other, something that we encounter perhaps occasionally, perhaps rarely, but which gives us a sense that there is more to life than our being these biological machines who are here for procreation and to make sure that we're able to grow our offspring till they're old enough to be independent and have their own offspring, so that our genes can transfer to the next generation. There's more to life in existence than it. There's more to life than the hedonism of immediate pleasure. There's some deeper underlying purpose to what we do and our connection and relation to other people. So that was his broad question, and he was over time inundated with responses to that particular question. He ended up with in the region of 6,500 letters that people had written to him. And this was in a period, I doubt that any of these were kind of emails and things. That these, probably the latest ones, date from the kind of early 90s in the collection, as far as I remember. And these were meticulously transcribed by members of the research team, and they've been made available. So here we go. This is the University of Wales, where the Alister Hardy Research Experience Research Centre still exists. They have a website that's very worthwhile checking out. I'm sure many of you already know about its existence. If not, it is definitely worth checking out. And Bettina Schmidt here is responsible for the kind of research arm of that, the active research group. And they have made available to members the database. And the database basically has a case page for each individual letter that somebody's written. It gives you some basic demographic information about the person, and then a verbatim transcript of the letter that they've written originally to Sir Alister Hardy, and then those people who succeeded him. So one of the tasks that we've had is to trawl through that collection, looking for cases that might be of interest to parapsychologists. Many of the cases, as you might imagine, relate to purely religious types of experience. Many of them relate to the comfort people have gained from their engagement with scripture, again, from different traditions, primarily Christian, but also other traditions. For example, in facing the adversities that they've had to face in their lives. And honestly, some of the accounts are awfully heartbreaking, the kind of things people have had to overcome, and the fact that they've had comfort from their faith in God and in religion more generally is kind of really powerful. Some of them is kind of speculative pieces. And very occasionally, frustratingly, people will say, I've had loads of parapsychological experiences. I'd love to tell you about them. Just get in touch if you want to know more. And so the letter ends and we never hear from that person again, which is extremely frustrating. But we have a very large collection. So a colleague and I, Rebecca Linnett, we read all of those 6,500 letters, and we were able to select out of those 1,038 that met our inclusion criteria. Now, I don't have those to hand. If you're interested, I could certainly dig them out. I can't remember them off the top of my head, but they fundamentally relate to the idea that the person is describing an experience, either a personal experience of theirs or of somebody very close to them, rather than, for example, reading an account or seeing a documentary on television. And there's enough detail there for us to be able to map that experience in a little bit of detail. So rather than just saying, for example, I've had dreams that later seem to come true, that wouldn't be sufficient to qualify for the database, because they don't actually describe any of the dreams and there's nothing there that we can analyze. But that still is a very healthy number. So we ended up with over 1,000 of these cases. And these now have been content analyzed. And by that, what I mean is we have an enormous Excel file that looks like this. And each row of the Excel file relates to a single case, so a single letter that was submitted, and it's been scored across various dimensions in terms of its content. And this allows us then to generate quantitative data that tells us what proportion of the cases involve what kinds of elements or features. When we planned this study, we had hoped that we'd be able to do some demographic work. So be able to explore whether, for example, things tended to coincide together. So when people described one phenomenon, did they tend to also describe another phenomenon? Or when they described a phenomenon, did it tend to occur under certain environmental conditions? An example might be, if you see an apparition, do you report the time of day when you saw that apparition? Is it most likely the case that apparitions are seen just as people are drifting off to sleep, or as they're just waking up from sleep when they may be rather drowsy? And it might speak to particular explanations or mechanisms to account for the experiences. So that was kind of the plan. Unfortunately, the letters are extremely light when it comes to the demographic features. And so instead, we focused on the incidence of the various kinds of phenomena. So I'll tell you a little bit about that work. This is fairly far developed. We're at the stage now of working on a paper to be published that describes the outcomes of this study. We've presented these results at a couple of conferences when we did conferences face-to-face. And so we're on that final stage now of writing up. And this is what we found. So I don't know why that writing disappeared. Hopefully that's not going to be true of a few of these. By far the largest number of cases that we selected, the highest proportion, related to apparitional type experiences. And we further subdivided those in terms of the modality of the experience. There were two phases to the project, basically because it's important to be able to feed back to the research community on your progress. So we actually reviewed half of that sample, so just over 3,000 cases, pardon me, and gave a preliminary report on those. And then we went back and looked at the remainder of the cases and treated that as a kind of a confirmatory to see whether the figures were about the same. They vary quite a lot, but we can see that apparitional experiences are really quite common, that they tend to be in the visual modality most commonly, and then they might have an auditory feature. Note as well, obviously, these percentages don't add up to 100%, because of course, when people have an apparitional experience, it's possible for it to be in more than one modality at the same time. So you could have a visual element and an auditory element, or you may start with a sense of presence, and then maybe that develops or evolves in some way, and then you have a visual experience as well. So it's possible for you to tick more than one of those boxes. And things like olfactory and tactile tend to co-occur as well, for example. So we see the kinds of experiences people have and which are the most common. And here are some of the examples from the case collection. I don't know how I can, there we are. I've minimized the picture so I can see the whole slide. Here we go. So an example of a visual apparition type is when my daughter was about 3 years old, she asked me one day who the man was who had just left the room. I was disturbed by this, understandably, but didn't say anything to her. But when later we looked at some old photos, she pointed out my deceased dad, whom she's never seen, and said that this was the man that she'd seen. She has never commented since. So this is quite interesting. It speaks to evidential, because this isn't somebody that they knew or had expected to see. So there was no element of suggestion there. Ideally, we were just talking before we started the session about the documentary series, Surviving Death, that's on at the moment. And there's a really interesting reincarnation episode. And in reincarnation episodes, it's really important that, for example, when you present somebody with photographs and ask, was this person the person you thought you were married to in your previous life, after having done some research about the identity, you can't just present the photo. You have to present a number of photos and say, are any of these people familiar to you? And if they point to the correct person, you say, well, who is that? How do you know them? And so the information comes from them rather than being suggested to them. So that's quite useful. So a case like this is quite strong, quite powerful. An example of the auditory type of apparition. I once heard a voice say, have you heard the news? It was my sister's voice, although I'd not heard from her for nearly 2 years. I telephoned from Cheltenham to Coventry, where she lived, only to find that she'd just returned there from Canada. She was so surprised to hear from me right out of the blue. I told her what I'd heard, and she asked me what time I'd heard her voice. It was 6:30 or just before. And she then told me that about that time, our brother in Liverpool had telephoned her to say that our other brother-in-law had died from a sudden heart attack at only 54 years old. My sister had turned to her own husband when she'd received the news and said to him the very words that I'd heard in Cheltenham. Have you heard the news? So-and-so is dead. So again, these are quite powerful cases. One thing that certainly comes across from these letters, among the others, is how profound the experiences have been for the people who are reporting them. It's not uncommon for the letter to have been written perhaps 30, even 40 years after the stimulus event. And nevertheless, that event is still so important to them that they've remembered it in detail, and it's still important enough for them to want to share that with other people. And that seems to be quite a common feature, although people may nevertheless be reticent to share that experience with many others in this kind of discreet form, where they can write a private letter to Sir Alister Hardy, who's expressed sympathy and interest. They're able to share that. The second most common type of experience in our collection was extrasensory perception. So these are situations in which people seem to acquire information from their environment without using their conventional senses, or they seem to have a connection with other people that they shouldn't have by normal means. So apologies, we're going to have this blip, I think, going through the title needs 2 clicks. And these take a number of forms. So ineffable foreboding, I alluded to before, and this is when people have just this vague sense of uneasiness, things aren't quite right, something's wrong somewhere. They may be able to fixate on a particular location or a particular individual with whom something is wrong, but it's not like the full-blown experience where they know this is the information that I've had communicated to me. A popular form of experience is telepathy. So telepathy is distinct from clairvoyance in parapsychological terms, in the sense that telepathy refers to ostensible mind-to-mind communication. So the experience seems to reflect the subjective experience of another person, usually in real time. That they would happen, whereas clairvoyance seems to be gathering information from your environment somewhere, maybe information that isn't available to anybody else. So as we'll see, maybe the discovery of a lost object, something like that, maybe an instance of clairvoyance. And precognition, as I'm sure this audience will know, relates to acquisition of information that doesn't exist at the time of the experience. It lies in the future somewhere. So there could be no normal mechanism by which you could acquire that information. And some of them we've categorized as general ESP because there isn't enough information to decide which of the other categories it might fall into. So what kind of examples do we have for those? Well, here's an example of the telepathy type, and this is quite explicit, it's quite cognitive. So my husband went one night to a trade council meeting. I was at that time ill with pernicious anemia. I came over very ill and I called my husband's name out loud, wishing him to come home. And about a quarter of an hour later, he came in, presumably early from the meeting, before he should have been expected back. He asked, are you all right, dear? Have you called me? And when I told him I had, he said, yes, I heard you, and I came as soon as I could. I have no explanation about this, but it's quite true. An example of the foreboding type, is case number 4437. So we keep the record numbers for these. These are the cases in the Alister Hardy database, so that other people who might be intrigued by these would be able to seek out the individual cases for themselves in that quasi-public domain document. If you're a member of the I forget what the organization is called, but the organization that the general public can join, you can get access to that database. My mother had premonitions over everyday affairs. For example, one day she went shopping, taking the 20-minute branch line train journey. She got to her destination and suddenly felt she must quickly return home when the train went back from the terminus. So rather than going shopping, she got straight back on the train and went all the way back home again. Our house was situated near the railway station. As my mother stepped from the train, she saw smoke pouring out of our home, and by quick action on the part of the fire brigade, whom my mother called, the house was saved. So it's clear from the description that at the time when she was coming back to home, she just knew that something was wrong, but she wasn't able to specify what that might be, or would be revealed once she got there. I thought I'd included, so there are a couple of really interesting cases where people discovered objects. This might involve, for example, one woman described one husband described being out in a field, and he lost a ring. I don't think it was his wedding ring, but it was an important, meaningful ring. And he was distraught about this. And his wife went out into the field and immediately walked to the spot, and she found the ring within 5 minutes in a large field where the crop was about knee high. So it would have been extremely difficult to see any sign of it. And she absolutely attributes that to a paranormal inference. With all of these cases, it's really important to stress that they're not really evidential to us in the sense of demonstrating that these phenomena are real, that counter explanations don't apply, but they absolutely, I think, speak to the process. They tell us something about the circumstances under which people report these experiences, and they have a psychological reality because the people who report them, for them, these are real and they are the things that they believe them to be. We had some cases of near-death experiences that people reported. This is a relatively small collection. So we have 91 cases, so shy of 100 in our 1,000, but it's still about 9% of the cases that we've gathered. These very typically involve the person themselves, and we have coded those according to the kind of classic typology that starts with Ray Moody, but has been popularized by Kenneth Ring in terms of the features of the experience that might unfold. And we see many of the features described there. So we've got some examples of those. Oh, wrong way. Yeah, here we go. So an ND encounter type. So quite reasonably often in near-death experiences, people will have an encounter with some entity. This may be a spiritual being. It may be a deceased relative that they recognize in some way, even though they may be people that physically they never knew in life. And so one example of this, case 4211, when she was very old, my mother was taken ill at our house near such and such a place. All of these cases, despite how they appear in the Alister Hardy database, they've been anonymized for our purposes as part of the basis for getting ethical approval for the project, so that people's identities are protected. Although they disclosed the information to Alister Hardy, they may not have been comfortable with other people, for example, writing about them in published books, although a number of people have cited cases in books. So we've always anonymized people. So here we go, taken ill in Uruguay, and she could never be moved. At the beginning of her illness, she declared that she had been taken down into a most beautiful place and saw a light coming towards her, which formed itself into the figure of a friend of hers. And they gave the name, who called out, "Do you know that I've gone on?" "No, but can't you take me with you?" "No, there's still something you must do." And there's this real sense of denial that you have to go back. There are things that remain undone that you need to finish. Then this entity faded away, and my mother remained wondering what it was that she must do. This is described in the letter as well, not in the letter. We would characterize this as what's called a Peak-Indarian case. It's a case in which a person has an encounter with somebody whom at the time they didn't know was dead. and in a way that might serve as evidential that there's some previously unknown information that they're able to access because they identify somebody as coming to receive them and to welcome them into an afterlife. And yet at that time, they didn't realize that that person was deceased. So that gives it greater interest. Very often in the early stage of an NDE, people might report an out-of-body type of experience. They may be watching the resuscitation procedure, something like that. Some of the cases in this collection, it seems really interesting that it was not at all uncommon during dental procedures, where maybe the gas mixture wasn't exactly right, and they suddenly would experience an out-of-body experience. In this case, I was 8.5 years old and nearly died in so-and-so dental hospital after having a general anesthetic for a tooth extraction. I'd recently recovered from measles and my mother didn't know that she ought to tell them. And obviously that led to complications. As things were, it was too soon after the measles and I collapsed. Suddenly I shot up to the ceiling as if I were a piece of cork in a bowl of water and actually watched the doctors massage my heart. There was an amazing feeling of lightness both in my weight and in the scene below. The real me was up there near the ceiling. And with equal suddenness, I walloped back to my body, opened my eyes to see the doctors grouped around me. And again, as I say, we have a collection of similar cases to that. That one's fairly prototypical. Unfortunately, time prevents me from giving you lots and lots of details of some of these other cases. We're hanging on for that invite from Anne back to visit the Conan Doyle Centre again when things are back to normal or normal air. And we can certainly share more of these cases with you if you wanted to come along there. Other experiences fall into a number of categories: out-of-body experiences, healing, some mediumship cases which were quite meaningful to the people who described them, psychokinesis cases. So there are two categories here. You see there's a dashed line for phase one. One of the problems with content analysis is that you have to determine the categories that you're coding for, so that all the analysts are working to the same scheme. And in working through phase one, we didn't think to include as separate categories healing or psychokinesis. At the end of phase one, we have an opportunity to tweak the design a little bit. And so at that point, we did introduce some extra categories and we're able to capture some such cases in the second half. The PK ones, I don't know if we've got an example of one here. The PK ones are very interesting. They reflect Louisa Rhine's collection as well, in that very often they seem to be anomalous physical phenomena that relate to the passing of somebody that's important to the person, a loved one. And it's that coincidence in time that seems to be particularly momentous for people. So let's see at the examples we've got. Okay. Oh, no, I've not got any for you today. Okay. So that's where we are. So one of the things I've picked up from across the series of cases is that the experiences tend to be regarded as momentous. These are some of the most precious things that have happened to the people who are disclosing them. You know, they hold them very dear. And they give them a sense of conviction that there's more to life than the veneer, the surface property, the surface quality of things. Apparitional experiences are the most common, followed by ESP experiences, and NDE type experiences were the third most common in this collection. Hello? Oh, I'm just getting feedback now. That's what it was. I'm talking to myself there. Okay, I shall carry on. And sharing individual accounts will give us an insight into the lived experience. And what we can do when we have this the flexibility of a larger document, a book chapter, for example, is we can present one or two prototypical examples of a type of phenomenon, and then also include others which are variations on that theme that kind of illustrate nuances or illustrate idiosyncrasies in that experience. And what that can partly allow us to do is to effectively normalize those kinds of experience, so that people who might read those accounts or see something on YouTube where we're describing this research, they can recognize that they're not alone in having their experience, that other people have had things very similar to the ones that they've had. And those other people are also not particularly gullible people. They're very sane and healthy, able to hold down jobs and relationships. And they don't necessarily open up a Pandora's box of experiences. They don't suddenly become hypersensitive to all things anomalous. There may only be one or two very precious events that happen to them, but the rest of their life is very much grounded in the mundane. And also that these people are not pathological. That, you know, this wasn't a forewarning of something that was seriously wrong with them, and that the experiences were delusional, the result of some form of pathology. Those kind of lessons I think are important. Okay, the next collection. So as if we're not busy enough, we also were very excited to be able to gain access to a collection of letters that were curated by J.B. Priestley. And I'm sure many of you know who J.B. Priestley was. He was a very popular dramatist and social commentator. He played, I think, an important role during the war in giving radio broadcasts that were intended to boost morale. I'm not sure if he was knighted. I'm pretty sure he was knighted as well. There's certainly a statue of him in Bradford. And you may recall from his plays were extremely popular, that many of his plays actually play around with notions of time. Things don't evolve in the normal sequence that we would expect if causes come before effects and so on. And that's, without spoiling the plot for anybody who may never have seen it, that's a core element to An Inspector Calls, probably his most famous play, where things maybe are not quite as they seem in terms of how the temporal elements fit together. So he'd always had a fascination with time, and he reached a stage where he decided to focus on a project where he would write a book which was a factual book that focused on man's, as he would describe it, understanding of and relationship to time. This book came out, it was published and called Man and Time. And as he was working on the book, he was doing his usual round of media appearances. He was being interviewed for the print media. He was most importantly interviewed by Hugh Weldon for a BBC TV programme called Monitor, which aired in the UK, but also aired in other countries, including Australia and New Zealand. And in that, he described this ongoing project that he was working on, and he was mapping it out in various ways. So looking at what philosophers might have to say about time, what do physicists have to say about time, how do we understand historical progression and things like kind of evolution of thought, those kind of things feature in the book. But he was also interested in parapsychology and the idea of people having inklings or premonitions about future events, or having other kinds of experience that suggest that under certain circumstances, the passage of time can be reorganized, can be shifted. And so in the process of these print interviews, and particularly the Hugh Weldon interview, he mentioned that he was interested in hearing from readers. I think I've got the exact phrase here, that they were looking for accounts of any experiences that the general public had had that appeared to challenge the conventional and common sense idea of time. It featured in the Sunday Telegraph, the Sunday Times, Radio Times and Punch, as well as other places. And here is a picture from the book which shows you many of the letters that were sent to him. He was quite inundated with letters from around the globe from people who'd taken up the challenge and had written to him about their own experiences of weird relationships with time. And this collection of letters was bequeathed to the Society for Psychical Research, and their special collection is housed by the University of Cambridge. And other letters were bequeathed to the University of Bradford, which has a special collection devoted to matters J.B. Priestley. For this second project, we were prompted to act, to maybe take another look at those letters. He devotes a couple of chapters in his book to them and explores them there. But we felt that more work could be done on them. There's a handful of other researchers who've spent time with the letters as well, and I can tell you about those later if you're interested. But he importantly says in the book, I offer no careful analysis, no exact figures. He simply cherry picks instances that he reproduces in his book. If without such treatment they cannot be accepted as evidence, then we shall have to do without evidence. To tell the truth, after they reached 1,000, I stopped counting them because this kind of activity bores me. And my secretary, having helped me with the first great rush, had other things to do. But I have read them all, with the exception of long screeds from obvious madmen, detailed accounts of books I'd read myself, and letters from people who thought I was in need of a sermon. So that didn't feel to us like it was a particularly systematic or thoroughgoing analysis of the content of those letters. So we set out in this project to visit the archives in Cambridge and Bradford, to check the state of those cases in the collection, to review some of them to see if they were worth working with more intensively, and if they were, to systematically catalogue the individual cases, maybe bring them to more public attention, and then subject them to more of a multivariate kind of analysis where we look to see whether there were common elements. So when people, for example, reported a particular type of precognition, that they tend to be in the same state of mind, were they in the same circumstance, were they always alone, for example, were they in company, those kinds of features. Priestley offers his own characterization, not very systematically again. Some of the letters have a letter of the alphabet written on the first page, and this is very loose and not terribly useful for us to use. And then one analysis from Katie Price found that there were 938 letters in the collection, differs somewhat from our own accounts. So here we are, thanks to Simon Sherwood, Dr. Simon Sherwood of the University of Derby. He collaborated with me on this project. So on the left, that is the University of Cambridge library, and that's Simon and me in the library working through the collections of letters. They bring them out to you in boxes so that they're protected from the elements, and you're only allowed to access a box at a time. You're not allowed to scan or photocopy anything, but you are these days allowed to take digital photos. So we spent our time simply photographing every page of every letter in the collection. Some months later, when we'd recovered from that exertion, we went up to the University of Bradford and we spent a few days there doing something similar with the collection of cases that exists at the University of Bradford. This is what the letters typically look like. So some of them are typewritten. The vast majority are handwritten letters to J.B. Priestley, very often care of the BBC, sometimes with partial addresses to J.B. Priestley in England somewhere, but obviously he was well enough known that they were able to find their way to him, and he was able to gather them all together. I can say that we have photographed in total 1,123 individual letters, and that doesn't include various enclosures that are in the collection. People might have sent photocopies of, for example, other people's articles, book chapters, newspaper cuttings, things like that, which are not really subject to this analysis. We have that digital collection that we can then work with at our leisure. That whole data set at the time of speaking has almost completely been transcribed. So my collaborator with that is my daughter. She is a psychology graduate, and unfortunately she got arm wrestled into collaborating with me on this project. And we've been doing this for at least 12 months, reading these letters, transcribing them, checking in with each other to see what on earth some of the words might mean. But we're nearly at an end. And the intention is to produce an electronic database, maybe not with a degree of sophistication that we see with the Alister Hardy research group, but at least something that can be public domain so people can access those letters without having to apply in advance for a membership card, a temporary membership card, to get into the libraries to access their special collections. So that's our first stage. We've read through the letters as we're working through, but we've not subjected them to systematic analysis of the sort that I just described in terms of coding individual cases, but that will come next. And then we can start to look for common elements. So here's just a snapshot of some, to give you a flavor of some of those cases. As I say, primarily they involve some kind of relationship with time. So we wanted to look at them in particular because we thought they might explore precognition. And of course, there are many cases like that. So for example, some years ago, I met with a motorcycle accident, the result of which I was rushed into hospital and underwent the operation for appendicitis as well. While there, I was very ill. My husband was asked to stay in the hospital. 2 nights after the operation, the night nurse reported I'd spent a very restless night. On being questioned by my husband, I said to him that I saw fire in part of our house in the roof of a pippin pot trivet. All of those words are English, but I don't know what they mean together, which is why we've put the sick in there. And we're struggling to get out to help put it out. I described to my husband exactly where the fire was. This was about 6 a.m. and at 11 a.m. my husband was phoned by the fire brigade to say that they were fighting a fierce fire at exactly the place I described. The fire occurred at a most unlikely spot. And then we have precognitions that were acted upon and averted. And these are particularly interesting from the Louisa Rhine perspective because they represent something of a paradox. If we have a premonition about an event, but then take steps to avoid that event, and we do successfully avoid it, then what on earth did we have a premonition of? Because the future event never transpired, it never actually occurred, so couldn't act as a stimulus to produce the dream or impression that we had about it. So we can talk about that as well during questions if you'd like. So here's an example, quite a trivial one. I dreamed, well, maybe not actually, depending on what would have happened. I dreamed I was on top of a bus with my dog. It was an older type of bus with the curved staircase. I can't see that word. Can I move that? Yeah, stairway to the platform. As I was descending the stairway, the bus started to move very suddenly, and I was thrown forwards onto the pavement, cracking my skull on the curb. I remember the dream on waking, but as I didn't intend going out, I didn't think much about it. Later in the morning, I noticed that my dog was distressed, and finding a large inflamed swelling in his ear, I decided to take him to the animal clinic. I was descending the stairway when I suddenly remembered the dream and thought, I'm on the bus with the dog. And so I hung on extra tightly to the rail. When I was almost at the bottom, the bus suddenly moved off sharply. As I had such a firm grip, I was swung forward and badly strained my hand, which got twisted around through maintaining my hold. But had I not had the dream, or had not suddenly remembered it and held tightly to the rail, there's no doubt I should have pitched headfirst onto the pavement. And the senses of foreboding that we saw previously, the next one is quite distressing, really. 18 months ago, my husband, a Cambridge scientist, died suddenly of a coronary thrombosis. This is distressing enough. We were extremely happy and had 3 children. But then 2 years before his death, I had an unexplained urge to obtain proof and recommendations that I was qualified to teach, as I'd married immediately on leaving teaching college 20 years previously. With great trouble and the writing of many letters, I managed to find an old principal who'd retired and who willingly furnished the necessary certificate. They were put away in the desk and more or less forgotten. At the time, I was very puzzled by the urge, verging on obsession, to obtain proof of my eligibility to support the family. But this is what I'm now doing by teaching, as there was no pension and I have 2 sons still at school. So it was almost like a preparation for this awful event in the future, although no direct impression about the locus of that event or its nature. Last year, my 14-year-old son died suddenly at school. For years, I'd had a feeling that my eldest child would die at the age of 14. It was a fear I disclosed to 1 or 2 people. I longed for him to be 15. As he was dying, I had a feeling that on that very day, 9 months from that moment, I should have another son. I did at St. Thomas's Hospital. I told them there of my premonition. And time slips. So these are quite interesting situations where people seem to visit a different time in history, and there's a small number of these, which are rather unusual. Here's an example. In my dream, I was going towards our village and was riding on something high. I could see the village, but all the fields were full of houses, and the ditches were pathways with black and white tiles. I told this dream to my father the next morning, and he said it was a silly dream. You could not come that way. It's a dead end. But after World War II, my husband and I were on a holiday to the East Coast, and we saw a bus going to my old home village. So we went for a ride on the top of the bus. After a long ride, we turned off the main road, and I said to my husband, we're on the wrong bus. We should have gone straight on. But he said it's got the village name on the front of it, so we must just wait and see. After a short time, we turned a corner, and there was my home just as I'd seen it years before, and we'd entered it from the dead end. There were houses, roads, and paths, and at the bend of the road, the council had painted the curbstones black and white, a wartime blackout protection. And finally, a retrocognition, so an experience that seems to relate to a previous period in history. When she was a child, she was taken to visit her aunt, so talking about a relative, her mother, I think it is. Her grandmother, yeah. So when she was a child, she was taken to visit her aunt, who lived in a terraced house in Preston. The house had a basement in which some servants lived. My grandmother slipped out of the house and was playing in the street with her ball when she saw smoke pouring from the basement. Her aunt ran out of the house into the basement and came out carrying a child in her arms. She took the child into the house, and my grandmother then went into the house. The aunt told her that what she'd seen had indeed happened, but many years previously. And strangely, this collection also has apparitional experiences that don't seem to be directly related to time. During the Christmas week of 1959, a brother-in-law of mine was operated upon and found to have cancer of the liver. We were told that he might live for some months, perhaps a year. He was brought home to be made as comfortable as possible. Members of the family went on different days to give a hand with the extra work involved. I was due to visit him, but had not been well, and my husband persuaded me not to go back when he brought me my early morning tea. So my husband was somewhat taken aback when he returned to my room 10 minutes later to find me up and almost ready to go out. For whilst I was drinking my tea, I quite clearly saw my brother-in-law standing at the bedroom door. He was in pajamas, he smiled and gracefully bowed to me from the waist, then closed the door. This was at 8:05 a.m. I told my husband that our brother-in-law had just died. This was so. When we arrived at his house, we learned that he died about 8 a.m. I don't know why he came to me. We had a mutual respect and regard for each other, I think, but I cannot say I knew him well. A third collection, which sadly I think I've run out of time for. I was really trying to pack too much in, but perhaps on another occasion I could come back, or perhaps Evelyn LCS, a colleague of mine who's worked on this project, might talk to you about a survey project we're working on, where we're asking people about their experience of after-death communications. So these are the experiences people have in which they seem to be visited by a deceased person, very often somebody that they know, quite often during the period when they're passing, so close to their time of death. And they seem to reflect a communication to say, I'm leaving you now, but I still love you and we're still connected. And for example, if there was unfinished business, things unsaid, or if you're left on bad terms, none of that is important. I still love you and I want you to get on with your life. So those are the kind of messages that we could talk about in it. We've conducted a survey. This is the team of us who are working on that project. And maybe on another occasion, we can tell you about all the exciting findings we have from this survey, where again, we have in the region of 1,000 cases, very detailed cases people have reported to us of ADCs that they've had that have had a profound effect on them. So if I stop there, does that make sense, Anne? Because I don't want to
that's I didn't want to interrupt you because it's so fascinating, but our questions are mounting up. So
absolutely, we'll go to the questions. So ignore all of that. I can tell you all about that another time. And we get to the last page, which is thank you for your attention, and please do feel free to get in touch. That's my contact email if you want to contact me.
Excellent, Chris. Thank you so much. Good, you've unshared your screen. That's fine. Now, so we've got 2 questions, oblique observations. Peter, I'm just going to get you to answer the question yourself. Let me find you. And Scott, can you unmute Peter, please? Peter Braun, you've got 2 questions and observations on my list. Where are you? Peter, are you there?
Can you hear me now? Yeah.
That's it, got you now.
Hi. Thanks, Chris. That was fascinating, really great. Again, it's not the first time I've heard you, and you're always fascinating and very engaging. Thanks very much. But I did, at the beginning, when you were talking about the experiments, I found myself thinking that there must be personal or cultural, or sometimes both, variations in the response of subjects to different kinds of stimuli. For example, I don't respond positively to nuclear family images. In fact, the very opposite. And as I was saying in my note, Hannibal Lecter might have a different kind of positive or negative experience regarding a particular meal. So how do you deal with it? How do you sort of sift that out?
Absolutely. One of the problems with that kind of research is that you have to average across lots of trials. So you're not really, because of the way you collate the data together for the analysis, you're not able really to take idiosyncratic responses into account. You just hope that if you get a large enough sample of people, they tend to average. So they just create noise in the data set that you've got. They use what are called the IAPT, so the International Affective Picture System, And this is a collection of thousands of photographs that have been rated for their emotionality along different dimensions. So the extremeness of the reaction that they evoke in people, but also the, so that's the kind of the valence. Is it? No, that's the extremity, and valence is whether it's positive or negative. And as you say, you know, some things are not everybody's cup of tea, but you can maybe average over lots of trials. So in a typical study, you'll have lots of stimulating images that are all different from one another. And the idea is that hopefully you react enough to some of them to show the effect. It's very interesting to note that some of the arousing pictures that are used are of a sexual nature. Perhaps unsurprisingly, some of this research is from the Netherlands. And what they find is, classically, across all studies, is that men don't react as strongly as women to arousing images generally. So either negative or positive, the reactions of men are much less. They need much stronger material in order to react to the same level.
Thank goodness the database isn't from Germany.
Well, you may know more about that than I do. I couldn't comment. So, but that's what they do. They just average across trials, and they recognize that it's a very noisy system.
Okay, Peter, while you're on, you've got another question here.
Do I? Oh God, I forgot what.
Silent upon a Picandarian.
Yeah, I just picked up the Keats reference on the way through, and I was wondering if it was just because of the sense of wonder in the NDE experience. Is that it?
I honestly can't remember. I did go to the trouble of seeking that out. I think the term comes from the kind of heyday of researchers. So we're talking about before the First World War, maybe between the wars. It's from that kind of a period, that phrase originally. And it is a literary illusion. Some of the most classic SPR evidence comes from the most convoluted cross-correspondences that relate to Virgil and Homer and all sorts of references that would have been commonplace to that academic elite at the time. You wouldn't have had to explain a thing. I suspect Picandarian fell into that category at the time. And I think it is something about that sense of wonder, or this encounter of a new vista, a new world, something like that, perhaps.
Yeah.
You know, maybe the afterlife reflects that. But it has been used specifically to reflect those instances when the people you encounter include people that you didn't ordinarily know had passed.
Okay, right. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Now, Louisa's asked, what was the inclusion criteria? And that was with the Alister Hardy database. I think you probably explained that. Do you want to say anything more about it?
Well, I can, absolutely. I'm sorry to say, we're doing so many things at once. I haven't got that at my fingertips at the minute, but of course it will reflect the idea that there is a fundamentally parapsychological element to the letter. So many of the letters, it's quite obvious that they don't meet the inclusion criteria because they're not about experiences. They're about their readings of scripture, for example, or just describing how these things have happened in their life and their faith has helped them to get through them. So in those respects, there aren't experiences that are circumscribed and described. And then some of the experiences fall outside of the scope of parapsychology. So they might, for example, include Marian visions, visions of the Virgin Mary, or they may include visions of Christ or some other deity or saint or angel. Angelic experiences we excluded from our collection because it isn't a phenomenon per se that's investigated in parapsychology, and we wouldn't have learned anything from exploring those that would have been useful to us.
Okay, thank you. Lance, I see you've unmuted yourself. That's very helpful. Do you want to ask your question?
Yes, I mean, you must have an impression from all the years you've been doing this of how many people have these. These are quite old databases, and I'm sure you've got some more modern ones or would like to get them. But what's your own impression? I mean, I always say that 1 person in 4, at least in any group, has had a paranormal experience. Do you think I'm right?
Now, that's a subject for another talk that I could give in the future. We've recently commissioned YouGov to conduct 2 separate surveys for us, which are representative of the national population, the adult voting population, 18 plus. And the first of those explored paranormal belief and experience in its entirety. So it has a lot of questions about a range of different phenomena. And the second commission survey looks at mediumship, specifically. That study is in collaboration with another colleague of mine, Ewan McLean, and we're not at the stage yet of being able to share any of the outcomes from that, except to say, I don't want to steal his thunder, but except to say that the number of people who have sat with a medium or witnessed a mediumship demonstration is surprisingly high. And a significant subset of those have been on more than one occasion. And when they describe their experience of a communication that they've had, they are surprisingly positive. We very much expected it to be more of a mixed bag, that there would certainly be a number of people who had very positive experiences, because we've also got a couple of open questions where we say, well, tell us a bit more about that, so we can follow through. But in fact, it was much more likely that the people had a positive experience, that they found it useful, that it was specific, that it was particular to them, than we expected to find in that survey. The stock response I give is that surveys have traditionally shown that anywhere between a third and a half of the population report belief in any of a range of phenomena. So if you have a collection of paranormal phenomena, one after another, for each of those items, the hit rate will be between, let's say, 20% and 50% of people will say, yes, that is something I believe in or I'm open to. And when you drill down and say, well, why is it you think that might be possible? The primary reason they give is experience, either their own experience or the experience of people they know and trust. So there's clearly a pathway there. This is why I have very little time for the claim that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, because this is anything but an extraordinary claim. You know, this is commonplace. There are cultures and communities around the world who would be bamboozled by the idea that we need to ask questions like, you know, is there an afterlife? Are people capable of establishing a spiritual connection with one another to know when somebody's in trouble elsewhere? It seems bizarre to them.
Well, Rupert Sheldrake suggests we should give up the term paranormal and just regard it as normal. So
which of course, exactly.
Good. Delighted to hear those comments. Thank you, Chris. Jenny Jameson, you have a question. I'm just going to ask you to unmute yourself. You can ask your own question. Jenny Jameson.
Oh yeah, hello.
Hello.
Hi. Sorry, just.
You said with respect to ESP.
Oh, sorry, I was just getting my
hello
video on. Hi. With respect to ESP and so-called abilities like that, are you of the view that potentially humans have always had these abilities, and that in fact it used to be a kind of language, but since we've evolved language further, that we don't tap into them as much? Because I'm sure I've read somewhere that, you know, I think there was that there was tribes, and maybe still is, that use a form of telepathy to communicate.
That's a really interesting question. And I have mixed feelings about it, because I think there's a couple of lines of arguments that go in different directions here. So a colleague of mine back in the day, I did my PhD up in Edinburgh, and one of the other PhD students at that time was looking at second sight in the Scottish Highlands. And the people that she was interviewing and talking to were complaining that second sight was basically fading out because people had no need of it anymore. You know, news could travel by conventional means. Everyone had a telephone in their own houses. And so you didn't need to know that your sister was traveling to stay with you for a fortnight, and you would only normally find out when she arrived. So you learned of it through second sight. And I know second sight is especially related to things like foreboding of deaths in the community, but those kinds of experiences. And nowadays, why go to all that trouble when you can just pick up a phone? So that certainly is part of that case. The flip side of it is there's an interesting kind of argument that William James, I think, was sympathetic to. There was a researcher called R.M. Bucke, B-U-C-K-E, who wrote about cosmic consciousness. And he drew on some of the great spiritual religions and individuals, so the biographies of the great spiritual leaders, and also people in his own era, so people like Walt Whitman, who were great mystics of his time, and was basically arguing that as a species, we were evolving were becoming more spiritually enlightened. And as part of that refinement, we were seeing people become more psychic, demonstrating that connection to a greater degree. So we see those kind of pushing in different directions. I certainly think that if psi is real, and I'm very open to that possibility, I doubt very much that it's a unique capacity of human beings. There are a number of really interesting studies of other animals, not least Rupert's own, dogs who know when their owners are coming home. But there are some amazing stories of animals who have been able to follow their owners across vast stretches of land when by accident, very often, they've been left behind. We don't understand, frankly, how homing pigeons home in situations such as when they were used to carry messages during the First World War, and the homing dogs that they used at that time. Their skills beggar belief. The idea that they could, through scent and through visual recognition of locations, manage to do those things makes no sense. So if we see a similar kind of capacity in other animals, and that kind of opens the suggestion to me that this is something that has been around a long time.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry for the long answer.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Chris. We've just got time for the last two questions, so that's great. Leslie Hallam, I'm going to ask you to unmute and you can ask your question. Leslie.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Chris. Really interesting stuff. I'm not suggesting for a moment that we should take the invitation to play in the same field as science, just because that's the kind of leading paradigm at the moment in terms of understanding most of the world. However, for a lot of people, especially in Western cultures, it does carry a lot of weight still. And I wonder if there's anything you're aware of that plays to the potential strengths of some of the experiences that you've been recounting within a more scientific paradigm. I'm thinking in particular of any studies where, for instance, precognitive dreams can be recorded at one point in time and checked against real-world events as they develop later in time, which would be relatively objective. I mean, a lot of the stuff you're talking about is still fairly subjective in terms of the whole area. You kind of
absolutely
make an act of faith, and then you believe this stuff, and it's very interesting in that respect. And you know, I'm very much on the side of the fence of being very open-minded about it, but still, it lacks a degree of objectivity. And I think even the things that you're looking at and coding into what seem like objective categories, it requires a degree of subjectivity to do that. Are you aware of anything that tends more toward the objective that scientists could look at and, you know, have to take on board and explain in their own terms?
Absolutely. I think that's a really important distinction. I think evidence takes more than one form, and it depends on which community you're engaging with as to what kind of evidence you want to present to those groups. So there's no point presenting a meta-analysis of statistics to a group of people that are not expecting that. So that's a key part of this, and I'll get to that part in a second. I think what's crucial about this kind of work, well, there's two crucial elements to this kind of work. One is it provides the foundation for what follows. So what does take place in the laboratory? The arc of that conversation has to be that we're grounded in lived experience, and then we take that lived experience and we then start to introduce the kinds of rigor and control that's expected of a scientific situation. And then we look to find ways to process the data so that it is as objective as possible and is least subject to the kind of biases that we know that we have, attributional biases and expectancy and so on. So it's part of that journey. In the early part, the priority isn't at all to provide evidence that these phenomena are as people think they are. So it certainly doesn't represent any kind of validation that telepathy really happened. Your understanding of it is the best understanding of it. It can't do that job. And in a similar way, a colleague of mine, Cal Cooper, was on Steph's Kitchen last week. And at the end of a very short and unsatisfactory interview, he was asked the question, so is there life after death then? as if any researcher could just say, yes, there is, or no, there isn't. You know, it's a nonsensical, simplistic kind of response. Instead, what those lived experiences, what we can do with those is to normalize them. We can say, these experiences are extremely common. Here are the kind of features that they typically have. Here are some explanations that might apply in some circumstances, but you are, you know, adept enough to digest this material for yourself and decide for yourself which of your experiences pass muster. And we've done that kind of work, for example, with the mediums that we work with, where we've introduced them to the scientific method, not to preach at them, but to say, here are some methods that might be useful for you to be more critical consumers of your own experience, and also to better enable you to respond to the jibes of critics. When we get to the other end, absolutely. So, and psychology is quite a broad church, so there's a greater breadth of approach in psychology, particularly European psychology. It's very open to qualitative and phenomenological approaches as a legitimate academic and scientific approach, but absolutely the quantitative and experimental component is a key part of that as well. Sadly, what we find is that even when we play the game by the rules, we still find ourselves my team conceded a penalty earlier on and just lost 1-0. You find yourself having penalties awarded against you. So the classic example is the Daryl Bem situation, where one of his intentions in using those methods from psychology, such as the priming situation, was to say, okay, if I take a technique or an approach, which is standard practice, there would be literally in the region of 10,000 experiments conducted using priming in various different ways. That's been used that often, and so much material has been published in peer-reviewed journals using that method. Nobody could object on methodological grounds to me moving two of the elements round so that it suddenly becomes a test of precognition. He published that research in a flagship American Psychological Association journal called the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, and there was an outcry. There was an absolute furore. How ridiculous that you've published this quack science. And yet everything was done according to the rules in a legitimate way by somebody who is in the highest echelon of American psychology. And none of that was enough to protect him from irrational criticism. That's the kind of situation we find ourselves in. If you want to look at the one flagship statement about the state of evidence, I'd recommend an article by somebody called Etzel Cardenia. I don't know if I can write in the chat to everybody, can I?
Yeah.
Sent to everybody. So, and I think this is open access. So this is Etzel Cardenia, who's written in a different journal. This one's called American Psychologist. If I spell that correctly, that'd be embarrassing if I didn't. That is a more technical paper where he says, here are the best evidence sources for academic or experimental parapsychology. This is what the cumulative evidence is suggesting. Make of it what you will. And the response to that, I've got an article called Withering Skepticism. And it's called that because the state of skepticism at the moment has withered on the vine. It defaults to sweeping statements, ad hominem attacks on people, suggestions or fabrications of flaws or weaknesses in studies that don't actually exist in those studies when you go back to them. And I've got line and verse on that in some of the articles I've been writing recently. I've plugged to the SPR. So as president, I have to write an article for their magazine, the Paranormal Review. And in that, I've been spending quite a lot of time complaining about the shoddy scholarship from skeptics. But that kind of is the situation, unfortunately, we find ourselves in. People don't seem willing to engage with the data and debate it. I'm very happy. I don't at all. I'm not precious about it. I don't expect all of these claims to turn out to be true. I think we will discover that there is error someplace in some of these phenomena. And it's part of how we grow and develop to learn what it is to be a person and the kind of errors that we make. But the kind of skepticism we get and the kind of critical commentary we get is no use to anybody. It doesn't provide any insight or any clarity or any kind of nudge for future directions of research, unfortunately. So I'll apologise and get off my soapbox now.
No, don't apologise. Thank you, Chris. And I know we're over time, but I'm just going to allow the very last question because it is from the president of the Scottish Society for Psychical Research, Innes Smith. Innes, can you unmute to ask a question? Innes.
Hi, Chris. That was a great
Hello.
talk. Hello.
Thank you.
Right, very quick one. Okay, your studies are sampled from many decades ago. Have you compared them with current or more recent studies to specifically examine trends across time?
Excellent question. The short answer is not for the two examples that we were able to work through in detail. The ADC project that foolishly I didn't leave myself enough time for is absolutely contemporary. So these are data that were collected within the last 2 years that we're collating. So these are living people who've had their experiences maybe over the last couple of decades. I think absolutely it will be really interesting once we get through these analyses to reopen that. I was hoping, maybe naively, that we might get more data than we did from the YouGov surveys. We managed to get real good value for money there, but we did sneak in a couple of open-ended questions that they collected for us, where we gave people the opportunity to, if they'd answered yes to a question that said, you know, do you believe that telepathy is possible? And if they say yes to that, we would follow up with a question that says, have you had any personal experiences of telepathy? And if they say yes to that, that would open up a third question, which was, are you willing to share any details of that in a form that would be anonymized if researchers want to quote it later? Unfortunately, that hasn't captured the depth of material that we've got from other sources. The ADC project, I think the figure we're working with is that we have over 1 million words from our respondents describing their ADCs, just from a single ADC question right at the beginning. Again, I don't want to steal Evelyn's thunder if she comes and gives this talk, but it's a very long survey, 194 questions. But about question number 5, after we ask, you know, are you male, female? A couple of other questions about you, is just tell us about your ADC in your own words, so that it's not tarnished by the kinds of questions we might go on to ask you later on. So it's just extemporized. And we've got over 1 million words in that we're going to, probably for the next decade, we'll be trying to work our way through that and make sense of it. That's the problem with this darn qualitative material. It's not as easy as crunching a few numbers. I could have done that in an afternoon. This is taking forever.
Does it qualify as child abuse for your daughter then, making her go through all that stuff?
She's a psychology graduate. It serves her right. She knew what she was getting into.
Absolutely.
Come on, Innes, that was another question. Lance is just prompting me here that Evelyn Aleister is coming in April to the Arthur Conan Doyle Centre. So
fantastic. So we've got
there you go. And you were plugging the SPR, so let me just give a plug to the SSPR because Innes has just been on, and I'll be giving a talk on Thursday about these things, about my book, which I said at the beginning, Chris wrote the foreword to, so about premonitions and things like that. So that's the SSPR on Thursday. So there's your plug back, Innes. So let me just thank Chris very much for another entertaining and interesting and just mind-blowing talk, and to hear your views on the fact that it's normal, not paranormal, which we've all been striving with for such a long time, is so refreshing and excellent to hear. I don't know if you can see, all the chats are coming up saying fabulous, excellent talk. So everyone has that, and I certainly hope that you will come back again. I'm sure Lance will have that in his diary for you when we can have those workshops in person again. You can maybe bring your team back again. But to Chris and to everyone here, thank you for coming. And lastly, a very important speaker next week, we have Dean Radin. So there you go. Thank you, everyone, and look forward to seeing you next week, if not something else at the Arthur Conan Doyle Centre. Good night and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chris. I'll be in touch.
Great. Lovely to see you all. Thank you for coming. I'm going to make one last comment. Someone asked about slides, and the film of this is usually made available to you. So someone asked about the slides, which will be on the film. So
watch this space, and if you've paid for the entry here, you can get the film.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. Good night. Thanks, Chris.